Welcome to Dealmaking with Laura DiFrancesco, the ultimate podcast for entrepreneurs and professionals eager to master the art of acquiring businesses. I'm Laura DiFrancesco, a seasoned M&A attorney and founder of Dean Street Law and a few other businesses. Join me as I demystify the complex world of mergers and acquisitions with in-depth insights and practical advice. Each episode is packed full of expertise, featuring discussions on the critical aspects of the acquisition process, from identifying potential opportunities to negotiating deals and successfully closing transactions. Whether you're a first-time buyer or a veteran investor, this podcast equips you with the tools and knowledge needed to navigate the mergers and acquisitions landscape with confidence. Welcome back to the Dealmaking with Laura DiFrancesco podcast. I am so excited to dive into another episode, elevating your deal-making skills. Today, we're going to be talking all about due diligence, one of the most important aspects of buying a business. So I'm excited to dive into this. It's a great continuation of our last episode where we were talking about mitigating M&A risks. Due diligence is one of the top things that you can do to mitigate those risks. We're going to be talking about the different areas of due diligence. We're going to be talking about how to integrate that into your process, as well as how to avoid common pitfalls. So I'm excited to take you through due diligence process, how long it takes, all the details of it. We're going to dive into deeper detail now. So thanks so much for joining us. As I mentioned, one of the most important things to think about in terms of due diligence is risk mitigation. There is uneven allocation of knowledge in a transaction. The seller typically has considerably more knowledge about the business, the market, the economy, perhaps than the buyer, at least the business. They know so much more about the business, the assets, the continuation of the business as an ongoing concern. And so that gap of knowledge is addressed through due diligence. And that's one of the best ways to mitigate risk in the transaction is through due diligence. So definitely, if you haven't listened to episode 5 on mitigating M&A risk, I definitely recommend that. So be sure to check that out. The other thing that we like to do with due diligence is, of course, it's confirmatory due diligence. And part of that is going to be value verification. Through your financial due diligence, there are 3 different types of due diligence. We'll go into greater detail, but they are financial, operational, and legal. So when you're going through the due diligence process, you might be asking yourself, what are the common mistakes that are associated with due diligence? And what are the costs of due diligence? How do you budget for due diligence? So first, let's talk about the common mistakes that we see in due diligence, which is not taking the time to verify that what the business that you think you're buying is the business that you're buying. For most people, this is one of the greatest investments that you'll make in your life, at least at this point in your life thus far. And so buying a business, given the financial investment that you'll be making, is really important to make sure that you have an idea of the business you think you're buying and making sure that the business you are buying is the business you think you're buying. So to do that, we go through the due diligence process. So what is that process like? What are the costs associated with it? And how do you budget for it? The due diligence process can be done very quickly if you have a deal on a fast track timeline, or it can be spread out if you're particularly concerned with mitigating broken deal costs and keeping your costs low. Of course, the more that you involve third-party vendors, such as your attorney and your financial due diligence provider, the more expense you will have. And if you don't do some of the early things that you can do to best position yourself for a lower likelihood of a broken deal, maybe perhaps doing your own operational due diligence first, or prioritizing financial due diligence before legal due diligence, the costs will increase significantly. So the cost is going to be so dependent on your target company and the level of complexity it has and what there is to be reviewed. So I can't give you a ballpark on exactly cost that it will be sometimes, and it also depends on the specific amount of financial due diligence that you need to do, and that's also going to be dependent on the level of due diligence that you do, both on the legal and financial. So you could have a quality of earnings, which is going to be most expensive. If you're looking at a sub $5 million deal, you're probably not going to be spending more than $15,000 or $25,000 on a quality of earnings. You may have something a little bit less than that. You might have a quality of earnings light. You might just do proof of cash flow. You might do your own financial analysis, and the bank will, of course, underwrite it as well. But the bank's underwriting is not your financial due diligence process. So it is important to make sure that you are taking care of your own interests here. Legal due diligence really depends on the level of complexity of the business, but you're probably not going to exceed $8,000 to $15,000 on a sub $5 million deal, but you never know. If it has multiple businesses, it could be more than that. If it's a very complex transaction, it could be more than that. But that's overall what you would expect. In terms of timeline, definitely speak to your providers about what level of timeline it's going to be. But for the most part, a legal due diligence timeline is going to be at a minimum 2 weeks, sometimes 4 weeks. It just depends on how much complexity there is. If it's a sub $5 million deal, it's probably going to be closer to 2 weeks, at least with us at Dean Street Law, maybe 3. And then if you're looking at financial due diligence, it again depends on the scope of work involved and the level of complexity, but it could be anywhere between 4 to 6 weeks, sometimes less if you're not doing a full quality of earnings. So it's important to take all of those things into consideration, because overall your due diligence timeline should take no more than 30%. Your primary due diligence timeline should take no more than 30% of the entire transaction timeline. You can continue doing due diligence beyond that, but you should start drafting purchase agreement and getting started on your transaction documents after that first 30% has been completed. So it's really important to make sure that you are moving judiciously through that exclusivity period that you have and that negotiation timeline, and that you don't take the entire time for due diligence. So let's go over financial due diligence. That is going to be one of the first things that you are going to be doing. So financial due diligence will be your confirmatory due diligence, looking at the financial statements and financial transactions within the business to assess the sustainability of the earnings post-closing. It's really so that you can understand the financial health of the business. And you're looking at all historicals, but you also, if you're getting a loan, will need to do projections and a business plan to be able to justify that you can pay back the loan. So you want to make sure that you have a full understanding of revenue verification, expenses. The key areas of focus in your financial due diligence is going to be revenue verification, expense reviews, and historical financial performance analysis. And that's going to really get into the nitty-gritty of financial due diligence. We are going to have some episodes with some financial due diligence experts, which I'm really excited to bring to you, where we will be having conversations with them in greater detail about this. But specifically, what sort of financial documents are reviewed during that process, again, it will depend on the scope of review of your financial due diligence process and what you're working with. But at a minimum, they're going to be looking at financial statements, bank statements, the expenses, potentially doing a proof of cash, proof of revenue, checking out to make sure that each expense is categorized appropriately, that revenue is categorized appropriately, that the financial statements are verified. You can also do accountant reviewed statements as well, as that's another way of doing financial due diligence. So there's lots of different options. And so what you have being reviewed will be tied to the level of review that you have. But those are all things, of course, your bank's going to need them, you're going to need them, and your financial due diligence provider, if you have one, will also need them. Sub 1 million, sub 2 million, you tend to see a lot more drop off of whether a external financial due diligence provider is necessary or required or requested from the buyer. It really depends on the buyer's comfort level with completing financial due diligence and the overall transaction value itself. So it just depends on their comfort level and whether they feel like they need someone else to get their eyes on the financials and to do a review. Sub 1 million, it's pretty rare to see a third party review, but it does happen, especially if there's not that knowledge of how to review them yourself. But 1 to 2 million, it's a little bit here and there. Above 2 million, it's pretty common to do a third party review. When it comes to navigating corporate law, entrepreneurship, and managing small businesses, experience matters. Dean Street Law is a boutique corporate firm specializing in mergers and acquisitions and additional focus in real estate, commercial transactions, finance, and corporate governance. With over $10 billion in deals closed, Dean Street Law has extensive experience representing hundreds of clients in thousands of transactions, from small businesses to Fortune 500 companies. Whether you need startup guidance or advice on closing multi-million or multi-billion dollar deals, we're your trusted partner every step of the way. Visit deanstreetlaw.com to schedule a complimentary consultation. Tax due diligence is also really important. In addition to financial statements, you will also review the last 3 years minimum of taxes that have been filed and paid, and reviewing that through the financial due diligence process as well. And your lender will, of course, request those documents also. Let's dive into legal due diligence, and then we're going to follow that by operational due diligence. So legal due diligence is a very hefty aspect of the due diligence process, because like I mentioned in Mitigating Deal Risks, episode 5, your legal due diligence will inform the terms and conditions of your transaction documents, both your purchase agreement and your ancillary transaction documents. So if you don't spend the time to do that legal due diligence, first off, your transaction documents won't support you the way that they should, and they won't allocate risk in a way that is customized to this transaction, to the target company. We provide a 14 or so page due diligence request list, and this goes over so many different aspects of the legal aspects of a business. So the goal for the legal due diligence is to, 1, uncover potential legal liabilities, such as pending litigation, compliance issues, intellectual property concerns. It's also to fully understand the assets and the structure of a business from a legal perspective, and so that those assets can be legally transferred, because if you don't know the assets that you need to transfer truly, how can you legally transfer them? So all of these things are integral to making sure that the money that you're spending on the business is actually buying you the business that you expect that you're buying. So the key documents or areas of the business that we focus on in legal due diligence includes contracts, leases, employment agreements, litigation, compliance, corporate governance, intellectual property, real estate, environmental matters, and so much more. That 14-page or so document is included in our Acquisition Insights course and templates bundle. So Acquisition Insights has over 80 lessons of video lessons, written materials, checklists, and guides of the legal aspects of buying a business. And in addition to the course, we also have our templates bundle, which has our battle-tested templates in there. We've done over $10 billion of transactions here at Dean Street Law since founding Dean Street Law. And so you can use our templates that we use over and over again. We have a pre-LOI due diligence request list in our templates bundle, and we have a post-LOI due diligence request list. For all of our clients, we customize that post-LOI due diligence request list to the company and the target and everything like that. But if you're looking to do as much cost saving as you can use our post-LOI due diligence request list to have the seller to begin populating that due diligence data room before we're involved, or if you plan on using someone else. But that does have all of our questions that we typically ask on a transaction at a minimum. And then we go above and beyond that as well, depending on the target company, what we know. And of course, there's follow-on questions and everything as well. And we evaluate all of the information and data and documents that are provided to inform us how we need to allocate the risk between the parties in the transaction, how we should be negotiating on behalf of our client, what the terms and conditions of those transaction documents need to be and how we need to legally effectively convey the assets or stock from the seller to the buyer. So that is what the legal due diligence process is. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into that in a minute, but first let's go on to operational due diligence. Operational due diligence is generally that due diligence completed by the buyer themselves. It's going to be an examination of the business's operational aspects, including the supply chain, employee structure, and operational efficiency. So this is really structured to be able to help you identify the operational risks of the business. This is where you're trying to walk in the shoes of the seller pre-closing. Now, they may not let you actually walk in their shoes because they may be concerned about you meeting employees or customers or gathering too much information pre-closing before you've really committed to buy the business. So this may be meetings and calls that you have on a weekly or a few times a week basis with the seller to gather as much information about the operations of the business as you can. So you really want to find out what those operational risks are and how they can impact the business post-closing. So if the business, let's say, had a year or a month that wasn't as successful, understanding what's the root cause, what are the leading indicators of that, what is influencing that performance. Also, what is the production of the business like? Are there inefficiencies? Are there people on the team that aren't adding value? Most times you want to make that determination post-closing, but if it's super obvious pre-closing, for instance, if there's a bunch of family members that are also working at the business that are really just kind of getting paid and maybe not actually working, then those may be folks that you offboard as well through the transition process. They may stay on for the first couple months, but they may be planning to offboarding afterwards. Or if there's other sellers in the business, they may be offboarding as well, or some may be staying. So really understanding the human resources aspect of the business. And then in addition, how do certain pieces of equipment or functions of the business contribute to the business as a whole? For instance, recently we had a deal where a particular piece of equipment was still an expense, but it was no longer adding value to the business. It was no longer really being used. And so it was requested that equipment be returned or paid off or it not be conveyed because that piece of equipment was expensive, but it wasn't adding value to the business post-closing. And if there's any issues with supply chains, if there's any issues with customers or vendors, it's important to start to get to know that information pre-closing. So what tools and technologies can you use to assist you during the due diligence process? We use a lot of information. First, you're going to have the data room. That's going to be, first you're going to have the due diligence request list. This is the information that you need, both formally and informally. A lot of the operational due diligence will be questions that you ask and prepare based on information you're learning in real time. So that's a big evolution. Financial and legal due diligence are more set of a standard, and then you evolve from there. So with respect to all of the due diligence request lists, that's going to be one tool that you can use. And then all of that information produced in response to those due diligence request lists will be in your data room, quote unquote. Because in small deals, sub 5 million, that data room, quote unquote, may be a Google Drive, it may be a Dropbox or some equivalent to that. Or in bigger situations, or if you have more sophisticated parties, they may use a formal data room provider where it tracks exactly who has access to the documents, who's printing and saving, and it all has the metadata tracking in all the documents to be sure of the maintenance of confidentiality. So it depends on the sensitivity of the information, sophistication of the parties, and overall preferences in what they use for a data room, but that is a phenomenal tool. Another tool that we use and technology is that we create a due diligence report and a chart. So we create a chart of every single due diligence material provided to us, and we have it categorized as the file name, the folder name, the actual name of the document, and a whole bunch of information for the legal aspects such as whether it's been signed, whether there's exhibits or addendums, whether it needed to be filed, whether it has been filed, all of these different things, the date of it, the parties involved, all of that. And that is going to be the fabric for the due diligence report that we provide to our clients. And so we track all of the notes related to every element that's been produced. It may seem a little bit out of the normal that we review all the financial statements of the business as well. While we're not doing financial verification, there's a lot of information in the financial statements that we as lawyers need to review. For instance, in your balance sheet, it's going to show your material assets. And so if there are, your GMC Sierra truck or your Ford Raptor or something like that, and you have all of these different vehicles, you need to ask, are these actually relevant to the operation of the business, or are these personal vehicles of the seller and the owner? And should they be paid for in the transaction, or should they be excluded assets? So those are questions that we're constantly asking when we're reviewing the financial statements. So in the due diligence report, we have notes where we put everything, and that's a great way to track it. I personally think that utilizing those tools makes it a much more efficient process, both from our perspective, from a legal team doing the legal due diligence, but also something that I see our clients using, Excel sheets and Google Sheets, to track due diligence materials that have been provided. There are also a lot of folks that use prioritization systems where we say something's high priority, whether it's been responded to, whether it hasn't been responded to. So there's a lot of tools that you can use, particularly in Google Sheets and Excel, to be able to assist you with the due diligence process. Unlock the power of in-house legal expertise at a fraction of the cost with Legal Foundations. Gain immediate access to a comprehensive legal crash course for business, a rich library of on-demand video legal support, and the opportunity to apply for group consulting with Laura DiFrancesco as your legal mentor. Whether you're starting up or scaling your business, Legal Foundations has everything you need instantly available. Join now and position your business for success. Visit lauradifrancesco.co/the-shop for more information. Let's dive into common mistakes and how to avoid them. One of the biggest mistakes that I see is overlooking key areas of due diligence. Key areas of due diligence are so dependent on the target company and the transaction specifically, but if you are confident that you are investing the right amount in your due diligence, you're working with third-party vendors such as your legal team, us at Dean Street Law, or your financial team if applicable, and you're confident that you're making the right decision on whether and when to engage them and how much work to have them do. For us, it's pretty straightforward what a business needs to do in legal due diligence. Yes, we can have add-ons, we can do litigation searches, UCC searches, all of that, but you always will require a certain amount of due diligence in any transaction, no matter the transaction value. So if you're not investing in due diligence, that's going to be a business call that you make, and the likelihood of something coming up post-closing is going to increase drastically. But of course, as entrepreneurs, we always have to make decisions of where to allocate our resources and what decisions to make. And this is all about risk mitigation and allocation. And if you're okay with taking on 100% of the risk because it's fine and it's okay for you, then that's something that's up to you. But I would always recommend having a lawyer review the due diligence materials, because it is so critical to make sure that anything that you're paying, $1, $10, $100,000, $10 million, is actually going to, one, purchase the business that you think you're purchasing, but also make sure that it's not going to cost you more in the end than it was even worth. And that's something that I see far too often, is where someone didn't do the due diligence necessary and something was so easy to fix. If the transaction documents had just addressed this, it would have been so easy to fix it to begin with. Whenever you do something right the first time, it pays dividends, I can tell you that. And then the other thing that I see as a common mistake is not understanding the legal structure of the business, not understanding whether the business is one legal entity or four legal entities, and which of them own which assets of the business, and the legal ownership of the business. I see this all the time. The seller says that the seller is one person the entire time they're marketing the business, and then you get into due diligence and find that it's multiple people own the business, whether it's spouses that own the business or minority partners, or there's subsidiaries, or there's complications in the organizational structure and chart of the business. This happens so often, and it's critical to understand these elements so that the business can be legally conveyed to you as the buyer, and so that you also know the implications. When you have minority stakes in the business, they may be required their consent in order to approve the transaction. And you want to make sure that their consent is received to be able to make sure that they can't dispute the transaction. They may also have minority preferences, rights, or feel ignored if they're not involved in the transaction, and may throw a wrench in things at the last hour because they don't feel like they have been heard or don't feel like they have been a part of the transaction process. So it's really important to not only manage minority stockholders and minority owners, but also stakeholders, which are your people who may not own a percentage of the business, but may have influence on the decisions of the owners. So these may be key employees, family members that we're supposed to inherit, family members overall, spouses, all of those are key stakeholders, and you want to make sure that you're getting the buy-in for key stakeholders. One of the ways that a lot of buyers do this is to take the family or take the spouse and the seller out for dinner or something like that, or take all of the owners of the business out for dinner or meet with them all to make sure that everyone's on the same page, everyone's bought into it, and that there aren't issues that are going to come up at the last hour from a minority stakeholder throwing a wrench in things. Some other preventative tips, aside from making sure that you're understanding all the stakeholders in the transaction and getting their involvement, is to really have comprehensive checklists. That's why we provide the pre-LOI and post-LOI due diligence request list in Acquisition Insights. That's why we are very comprehensive and have a 14-page checklist that we use at Dean Street Law, and also involving experts. Know what you're good at and know where you need help. Operational due diligence is definitely something squarely within the buyer's realm. Financial due diligence is something that if a buyer is not comfortable and the deal is $1.5–2 million plus, most likely they're going to have some level of financial due diligence. If the buyer's not comfortable with financial due diligence at all, most likely at any size, they're going to have some help, even if it's just having accountant reviewed financial statements or some sort of help. It doesn't have to be a full quality of earnings, but they will likely have some sort of help. And then, of course, your legal team. We would love to help you here at Dean Street Law. You can always schedule a complimentary consultation with us through the link in the show notes. And we are there to make sure that you have a comprehensive legal analysis of the business, comprehensive legal due diligence. It is absolutely critical to the success of the transaction and mitigation of risk going forward. It's one of the best investments that you can make in your transaction, is having the right legal support. So you want to make sure that you interview those experts that you're going to be involving well in advance of the transaction needing to close. Ideally, you'll have them lined up and ready to go pre-LOI, if not immediately post-LOI. And you definitely want to get them involved with at least 45 to 60 days of minimum of the transaction continuing on before closing. Because I would say if there is another biggest mistake that I see, it would be rushing the process. Rushing the process, not giving your experts enough time, not allocating for enough time for the seller to provide the information you need. Jumping into something without looking is just going to be a recipe for disasters. One of the best things that you can do is, of course, invest in the right people. But if you're not giving them enough time, if you're not giving yourself enough time, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot. It's going to be a potential for operational surprises, which are going to have a financial impact post-closing, and there could be financial discrepancies as well that you're unable to uncover due to not allocating the right time and resources to due diligence. So like I said, you want that due diligence to be the first 30% of your exclusivity period. That's why on day one, you should be having either your due diligence, starting and teeing up your financial and or teeing up your legal. Most of the time you want everyone involved on day one after that exclusivity period, because there's requests that need to be made and the seller needs to respond to those in order for anyone to start the due diligence process. So I do recommend getting started on it right away. If you have the time in your transaction timeline to also front load the bank's due diligence, your lender will have a tremendous amount of due diligence that they need to do to underwrite the loan. And in order for them to provide a term sheet, which is going to be the terms that they can offer you for the loan, they need a certain amount of financial due diligence and overall due diligence. In order for them to provide a commitment letter, they need even more information. So it's absolutely critical that they get as much information as possible, as early on as possible, and that you really prioritize them getting the information that they need, because they have a long underwriting process. And ultimately, if the bank doesn't underwrite the loan, and if you can't get a loan on the transaction and you need that loan to close, the likelihood that you're going to be able to move forward with the transaction is going to be very small. If you're trying to minimize broken deal costs, getting them as much information and as close to writing that commitment letter as possible, either pre-LOI or immediately post-LOI, is critical. And then you would like to, if you have time, start, of course, engage your attorney immediately post-LOI if you haven't already engaged them pre-LOI. But you do want to start on your financial due diligence and at least get the highest level of financial due diligence before we start our majority of due diligence. So that way, if you're looking to minimize broken deal costs, spreading things out like that, making sure that you time things and stagger things a little bit is one of the best ways to minimize the likelihood of broken deals. The next mistake is failing to act on your findings. It's important not only to find out what the issues are in the business, but then to use those as information to have solid transaction documents. And so you want to make sure that the due diligence findings are being translated into your transaction documents. That will help you to avoid overvaluing the acquisition. It will help you to avoid integration challenges, as well as issues post-closing that could have been dealt with pre-closing. So when you find those due diligence findings, you want to take a few action steps to be able to move forward in your decision-making process. It's going to be information that you're gathering. You want to first continue to ask questions, and that's going to be negotiation leverage if you need to retrade. Remember, due diligence should be confirmatory due diligence. In the event that something comes up, that is negotiation leverage for how you are going to structure the terms and conditions of your transaction documents. And it's going to be central and so critical to your decision-making process, determining whether the deal is something to move forward with or not, and how you can structure the deal in a way that makes it make sense to go forward. So all of those are going to be a few of the action steps that I recommend you taking once you have your financial, operational, and legal due diligence. And we can wrap it up from here. I think we've had a great conversation about due diligence thus far. I hope this has been helpful in helping you elevate your deal-making skills. Of course, be sure to reach out to us at Dean Street Law. We have our complimentary consultation in the show notes that you can schedule if you'd like to discuss this further, as well as acquisition insights, course and templates with tons of resources on this. We go into this in way greater detail if you'd like additional information on that. I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Happy deal making. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Deal Making with Laura DiFrancesco. I hope you found today's discussion insightful and that it brought you one step closer to mastering the art of mergers and acquisitions. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to follow and subscribe to Deal Making with Laura DiFrancesco on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. And if you found value in our discussion, please make sure to leave a 5-star review and share the podcast with anyone who may benefit from it. Sharing our podcast is the best way to show your support and help us to continue making more content just like this. So please be sure to take a screenshot and tag us on social media whenever you can. For more in-depth resources, be sure to visit our website at deanstreetlaw.com, where you can find articles, guides, and more information on our services. Or you can also visit lauradifrancesco.co/the-shop for more information on our legal courses. Don't forget to follow us and connect with us on social media for the latest updates, tips, and exclusive content. You can find us on LinkedIn, Search Funder, at LM DiFrancesco on X, and at Dean Street Law on Instagram. Be sure to join us on our next episode where we'll be discussing more deal-making tips and insights. I'll see you there.